I think some people are maybe a little bit nervous to find out that their decks secretly have been a tier 3, while everyone else's was a tier 1 or tier 2.
Distraction makers.
Wizards of the Coast came out and announced a bracket system for Commander.
Yeah.
As a way to help guide players to better Commander games. And, this is a really big change for the format. So a lot of people are maybe a little uncomfortable. They're wondering, there's a lot of unanswered questions. And so there's been a bit of speculation as to like, okay, well, are brackets even the right course of action here? And so things like point systems have been brought up, or do we even need this at all? What about the old power structure where, you just ranked your deck as like a 1 through 10 and had a rule 0 discussion to figure out how to like have a good alignment of player expectations at the table. For us, we're pretty pro bracket system. So we thought we should put together a video about why we're in favor of a bracket system and sort of the pros and cons to both if a point system was the way to go or a bracket system.
Before we start talking about more Commander Magic stuff, please, if you like our videos and our content, give us a little like and subscribe, maybe a comment down below. Also, if you're interested in joining our Discord, you can find a link to it in the description down below. And today's video is brought to you by...
My game! Bullets and Teeth and Aliens is now live on Kickstarter. It's a co-op card game for 2 to 5 players about blasting space bugs and getting paid. You can find the link in the description below. So if this sounds cool to you, please back the project. I would really appreciate it.
Back to the video. So just a quick summarization of what these systems are for those that maybe don't play Magic or don't obsess over the Magic news like we do all the time. So the proposed bracket system is that there's going to be 4 brackets. 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah.
And so far, there really hasn't been a whole lot of discussion other than a couple of cards for each bracket. So far, a little bit of speculation. Seems to be a mixture of like high-powered cards as well as specific play patterns. So you might not see like land destruction or stacks or control or whatever in that way. But you might see those in the higher brackets. The other proposed systems that players have been bringing up, some people have brought up like Warhammer's point system as an option, just a really, really robust point system to figure out like if your deck is 500 points or 400 points or whatever, or a more streamlined point system, something like Canadian Highlander. There's just a smaller list of cards, and those specific cards have a point associated with them, and you can only have a maximum of 10 points per deck.
So an example of each of these 2 point systems would be, let's say we're talking more about the Warhammer-esque point system. Every card in your deck would have some kind of point allocation associated with it, whether that's 1 point or 50 points. At the end of building your deck, you'd have like a point total of all the cards. Where in like Canadian Highlander, like you said, the only cards that have points are the most powerful cards in the format.
Right.
And then you have 10 points total that you can have in your deck. So something like a Mana Crypt is 5 points. So that'd be half of the points that you can even put in your deck just from 1 card. Where this sort of other point system that we've heard discussed is more like I can sort of build my deck in any way I want, but at the end of it, I'm going to have some kind of a point total that then I can have to inform the way that I have a conversation with other players. Okay, so let's get into some sort of pros and cons here about each of the systems. We're going to talk about 3 different categories for the point systems and the brackets and where we see the pros and cons in each. The 3 are going to be the complexity of the system, the creativity that the system can create in deck building, and then the potential for competitiveness of each of the systems.
Yeah. First, we want to touch on complexity. Looking at the point system, if you don't want to look at a point system, but the point system's just a part of deck construction, you technically can take any card that you want, and you don't have to look at how many points it is. You open up a Mana Crypt or whatever from Ixalan, and you put it into your deck, and you're fine. Now, your deck is going to naturally have a number associated with it, and you'll have to sort of count that out, and that'll be your way of sort of gauging what your power level of your deck is. But you can just accept like, okay, now my deck's a 600 or whatever, however many points are associated with it.
I've heard this referred to as a system that would be descriptive instead of restrictive, right? Where you're not restricting any kind of cards that people would put in their decks. You're instead having sort of an outcome at the end of deck building. So I think if we're looking at it in the most positive light, I think that's probably the way that you would present it. I think in reality, though, what would end up happening is you'd have play groups that would sort of cluster around certain point totals to try to get a particular type of experience. I have a 700-point deck, you have a 600-point deck. Can those two decks have a good game against each other? So if players then are sort of clustering around certain point totals, what will end up happening is people will play to that ceiling. So whether or not that's like, okay, let's say we're going to play around 500 points. I maybe have a deck that is 480 points, and you have a deck that's like 550 points. And like, at what point are we not close enough anymore?
Yeah, it's going to be a little ambiguous. And I think that some people are like, that's probably fine because that's kind of already how like people looked at the 7 out of 10 deck ratio or whatever.
Another problem, I think, with the point system in terms of complexity is that every card in your deck is going to have a point total associated with it. Right.
So when you want to pay attention to it, like, it's going to matter. If you choose to not pay attention to it, then it's great. You're going to just get a number assigned to it. But the minute that you want to be like, oh, well, I accidentally made a 700, but all my friends play 400.
Right.
Now you have to pay attention to every single point.
And now the system, instead of being descriptive, starts to become restrictive, right? Where you're like, all right, well, now I have to sort of make cuts and switch out cards for other cards to get my point total down, which is quite similar to how you end up building a Warhammer army, is that like a 2,000 point army is like the standard, at least back when I used to play. And so you whether you're playing in a tournament or playing for fun, everybody sort of coalesces at 2,000 points. And so when you're building a Warhammer army, you're choosing units and choosing the equipment that those units have, and you're doing so on such a micro level that you have to have a spreadsheet to do any of it.
Yeah.
Building a Magic deck is already complicated enough, and now we're going to add in a spreadsheet on top of it?
Yeah.
I don't think... I think what's tough here, too, is that, like this is a format sort of designed for casual players, and now you're asking them to use a spreadsheet anytime they're
right. It does feel a little bit like some of the players that maybe are suggesting this might be a little bit more sort of a little bit more invested of players, right? They probably follow a lot of Magic stuff, a lot of Magic news, they're on the Reddit, whatever. They're in the community more actively. Whereas other players that maybe they'll hop in every few months, every couple months or whatever for their local group, but they don't really like make that many new decks or follow that many new things. Like, those players probably aren't going to want to come back to your play group at some point and everyone's like, hey, do you know what point your deck is? Like, you upload it into Moxfield, and then Moxfield will give you the new point total. It
seems pretty difficult to make this work without some kind of software.
Yeah.
Especially for giving points to every card that you in existence, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
So let's brackets.
Right.
How do we feel about brackets in terms of their complexity level?
I think their complexity level, you will still have to look at cards. Yeah. There's still going to be a card list to look at, but I think it's going to be much closer in line to something like Canadian Highlander, where you can look at the list and it's a bit more binary than Canadian Highlander, where that has like, oh, it's a 5 point or whatever. This is just like, is it tier 4? Yes. Well, then it goes in tier 4 decks. Like, if it's in your deck is a tier 4 deck.
Yeah.
And I think that this has kind of been rubbing people the wrong way. But I think that if we're looking at this as trying to be as approachable and accessible to new players and existing players, I think this is very simple. I think this is probably a very, like, in my opinion, not to be too biased, very good, simple take on how to handle this.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that much more complicated than just a ban list, right? Like, the proposed system being 4 tiers, Gavin Verhey at Wizards of the Coast mentioned that he likes even split options, basically, so that you have to pick which side of the line that you're on. You can't pick in the middle, which leads me to believe that tiers 1 and 2 will be play for fun minded, and 3 and 4 will be play to win minded. But just different power levels of play to win. Ultimately, what this ends up doing is making the brackets more like a bit more complicated of a ban list, but hopefully players can just treat it in the similar way to a ban list, where they're saying, okay, well, if I'm playing, the other part of it too is that I think what has been hinted at is that tiers 3 and 4 will have like very specific cards mentioned. Where tier 2 and 1 will be more general philosophy ideas, which I think lines up with the play for fun versus play to win. So if you're playing, tier 2, anything in tier 3 and 4 is just effectively banned. If you're playing in tier 3, anything from tier 4 is banned. If you're playing tier 4, only the banned, whatever's actually like fully banned matters.
And chances are the players that are going to be playing in tier 3s and 4 are going to be the players that would be willing to make a Warhammer army, right? It's going to be players that are actually looking at these things more actively and want to probably play some of these higher power cards in the first place, meaning that they're going to be able to actually pay attention to a list and care about what's going on it.
Okay, so creativity-wise, this has been one of, I think, the biggest arguments for a points system is that in terms of deck variety, right? So you're basically able to, in a point system way, combine any cards that you want as long as you're just within the point total. You don't need to necessarily worry about like, oh, well, there's a, let's say I want to play Curiosity, but I don't want to play Niv Mizzet.
Right.
And so I can still put that Curiosity in my deck. I don't need to worry about it being a tier 3 or tier 4 card.
Right.
Because I'm not playing it in that tier 3, tier 4 kind of way. Theoretically, would maintain the kind of deck building creativity that Commander currently has.
The negative side to this, I think, is that as long as you have some sort of structure, players will always optimize the fun out of your game. That's a quote from some game designer, probably Richard Garfield, but who knows?
Yeah.
I think this goes against the grain of what Commander players kind of talk about a lot. But I think that what's happened is like Commander players have, as a community, tried to create their own sort of system without really creating a system.
Right.
And so their system previously was, well, my deck is a 7. And that was a little ambiguous and didn't really make sense. And no one really knew what a 7 was to one person versus another person.
Yeah.
But what saying your deck is a 7 is trying to do is attempting to tell someone like, hey, you have Ristic Study in your deck? That's not a 7. Or that is a 7 if you don't have this or whatever, right? Yeah. And you don't know. Yeah. But it's trying to create some sort of a formalized system. If you introduce something like brackets or even like a point system, players are going to see what points they're missing or the potential of what bracket they could be in, and they're going to try and do better in that bracket or tier or points.
This just comes back again to you have to think about the extremes when you're sort of developing or introducing any kind of system, and that system will facilitate particular outcomes. So if you're saying, okay, well, we're in a point system and we're playing with 500 points, you're going to have some amount of players that, one, they're going to play exactly 500 points, and they're going to find the specific cards that are underpointed or whatever. They're going to find whatever edge they can.
Yeah.
And there are just players that do this naturally. Even like, I'm not even saying this is a thing they're doing on purpose. It's just part of how some players' brains work.
Yeah.
And I can say that because mine does that sometimes and I have to turn it off. The other problem that the system runs the risk of is that, okay, well, you're not segmenting off particular cards into particular like play style brackets the way that a bracket system would, right? You're saying, okay, you can play whatever cards you want. We're not specifically targeting any particular card as being too powerful to be to facilitate a particular play style, meaning you could play, like, let's say you're playing at 150 points,
right,
and all of your cards are worth 1, but you're playing a Mana Crypt. So your deck, and let's say Mana Crypt's 50 points.
Sure.
So you're playing a 150 point deck, but like you are using a Mana Crypt in that, in the games in which you draw the Mana Crypt, your deck is going to look unfair. And that outcome is facilitated by the extremes of this system.
Right. We were talking about this beforehand about my vanilla creatures deck. That like my vanilla creatures deck would probably be a low costed point deck because I essentially have a bunch of creatures that would not provide any points whatsoever because they wouldn't see use really outside of a deck like this. But in order to make that deck function at a level that is equivalent to other decks that we commonly play with at our play group, I had to put stuff like Sylvan Library, I had to put Gaia's Cradle in there. I have to have these other ways of gaining advantage, either card advantage or resource advantage with mana, in order to compete and make vanilla creatures technically more viable than they naturally would be.
So let's talk about brackets and how they would facilitate a different kind of creativity. And I think in general, by removing particular cards from an environment, what you do is you open up sort of a vacuum where other new cards get to enter the space. Right. And this is a very competitive mindset. I will admit that some Commander players are doing this already, but when you actually facilitate it with a system, you're basically encouraging everyone to do this now, where, all right, we're going to pull out, these cards that are sort of defaults in everybody's mind in terms of high power, like a Vampiric Tutor, Mana Crypt, Ristic Study, Smothering Tide. Like, okay, we're going to move these cards into tier 4.
Right.
Well, now tier 3 suddenly opens up a lot more, and a lot more cards become viable.
Right.
Again, competitive mindset, but I think we have to acknowledge that Magic at its core is a competitive game, and the systems that you build for it have to facilitate competitive environments because that's the extremes, right?
Right. And I think that this is kind of a misconception that Commander players have. We've gotten comments on this. When we say like at its core, it's a competitive game, that does not mean that we're telling you have to play it competitively.
Right.
And like technically, if you don't want to do any of this, don't use the brackets. Like just that's if you like rule zero to not use the brackets when you're talking and hanging out with your play group.
Yeah, and I think a lot of play groups are going to end up that way. Okay, so let's look at competitiveness in terms of the types of experience that these systems facilitate. And I think that there's an idea that a bracket system will create more competitive environments than a point system would.
I think when it comes to, in particular, something like Canadian Highlanders point system, I think that unlike, I guess, a positive point towards the competitiveness is that if you are trying to get it into it competitively, it sort of sets this general standard that like you have 10 points for your deck and that's that. Right. And so there isn't these additional tiers, right? So all the creativity and all the decision making and all the metas are warped around whatever cards are currently available in that eternal format. And these are the cards that have points associated with them.
Everybody's playing the same game
basically,
still.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some a benefit to that in general. There's a risk with a point system in it not being descriptive of the philosophy you're trying to achieve, right? And this really is sort of the competitiveness of a bracket system saying, all right, well, if you're 2-1, you're playing for fun. If you're 3-4, you're playing to win. And a point system could sort of do this with a point total, but the problem is that you're still getting these cards that are like indicative of playing to win trickling down into like all over the place because they're, like we said before, you could have a deck that's majority point cards that cost 1 and one card that costs 50 and you're still a 150 point deck. You could also have the sort of example that you gave with your vanilla creatures deck where sort of half of your deck is really powerful and the other half of your deck is not very powerful. And if you draw the wrong half of your deck, you're either going to have like a really weak deck at a table where everybody else is more balanced, or you're going to have a really strong deck at a table where everybody else is more balanced.
Well, I think it also like I think it shows the maybe not cracks necessarily in the system, but sort of like the areas that you have the biggest benefit to gain, right? We've talked about how like Commander's system basically benefits players, encourages players to not interact with each other necessarily until you can combo off and like get your best combo, right? If we're looking at it at its actual core, at its played at highest level play, that's what it is. And so if I'm looking at like what type of a deck that I would get the most use out of, it's not playing maybe like very specific synergies, right? It's more than likely I want to spend all of my points on things that draw me more cards or get me more mana. Because that's the advantage that I'm going to be gaining.
Another extreme we can look at is, okay, well, if you're looking at the sort of some of the best combo potential in the game, you're looking at something like maybe Thassa's Oracle or even Tivit and Time Sieve, where how many points are you going to make those worth to then be able to segment those out of casual tables?
Right.
Where with a bracket system, you're like, okay, well, I have that card in my deck. I'm automatically segmented out of a casual table.
Yeah.
Right. Where points were like, okay, Time Sieve, let's say it's worth 50 points and Tivit's worth 50 points. Okay. Well, if all my other cards are garbage, I'm playing a 200 point deck or whatever. Right. Yeah. I'm still on the low.
You still have this
end.
Totally broken combo.
Right.
That you could still get because really it's just using tutors and you're just using the worst tutors, but it's still tutors.
Right. And so like that play pattern isn't moved to it isn't segmented out.
Right. And the play pattern is usually what Commander players complain about.
Yes.
Is it's not actually the power level of a deck. It's usually a play pattern. And technically, you could say like the play pattern being that you, I guess pop off with a mana crypt and a bunch of mana to go and tutor up your Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation or whatever, and then like win the game, like whatever. I guess that's just getting a combo piece. But like I think that most of the time casual pods don't like combo pieces in that way. Not if it's from the hand usually. Right.
Like immediate I win combos generally frowned upon in more casual environments.
Right.
Sure. Let's sum up our thoughts here. and sort of give some design takeaways. I think in general, the bracket system is trying to find a balance between accessibility and robustness, and also being able to help give players a tool that easily helps them facilitate a better philosophy experience, right? Where if you're across that line between 2 and 3, if you're 3, you're playing to win. If you're 2, you're playing for fun. And the cards themselves that are on these lists, I think, will be indicative of that.
I mean, Wizards did not necessarily have an easy task, and we shouldn't discredit the RC because the RC apparently has been working with Wizards on this.
Yeah,
so,
I think they were involved for sure. Yeah,
but I think that all of this is a good proposal because I think that something like this had to happen at some point. It's such a huge format.
Players just need more tools, I think.
And and players need more tools to be able to have more consistent games. And I also think these brackets are technically existing. Right now it's just that they're invisible or they're created by other players' sort of table politics or decision makings. Other players rule zeros at their tables. This is just formalizing those brackets. And I think it's just sort of revealing that these decks have always kind of existed in this way, right? And I think some people are maybe a little bit nervous to find out that their decks secretly have been a tier 3 while everyone else's was a tier 1 or tier 2.